This video was made possible by Wix. If you are ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics to try out one of their premium plans right now. In war, the high ground refers to the most strategic position available on a battlefield, and its occupation and exploitation gives the force occupying it major military advantages. With the dawn of the space age, it quickly became clear that the space around Earth was the ultimate high ground, and whoever conquered it first would put all other militaries at a severe disadvantage. So why hasn't it happened yet? That's what we'll find out today. In this episode of the Infographics Show, why can't we put weapons on space stations? The first and most obvious answer is a simple matter of physics. Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you throw a ball, the ball pushes back on you, but the friction between your feet and the ground keeps you in place. If you were to try throwing a ball on roller skates though, the force of the ball pushing back on you would knock you backwards. Because space is a vacuum, there is no friction. So basic physics tells us that if you tried to shoot a rocket or fire a big enough gun from a space station, you would send that space station flying out of control. You would have to either counteract the force of the firing weapon with reaction control thrusters, or make a station massive enough that the force pushing back on the station is minimal. Though of course, you would still need to adjust your orbit after every shot to make sure you didn't accidentally deorbit your entire space station. With an average cost of putting objects or fuel into orbit resting at $1 million per pound, either option makes for a very, very expensive weapon. Guns are pretty much out of the question, but you could potentially design a missile that's gently released with a small puff of accelerant before its rocket motor ignites and carries it away, similar to how the International Space Station undocks visiting spacecraft. So why not do that? Well, basic physics is again the most obvious answer. A missile re-entering the Earth's atmosphere would experience the same extreme heating that a returned space capsule does. In order to protect the chemical warhead from accidentally blowing up, you would have to spend a lot of money on shielding materials to keep the warhead cool during re-entry. Ultimately, it's just not worth it. Conventional land, air, and sea-fired missiles are much cheaper and less risky. But there is one type of missile that would be worth the cost, risk, and difficulty of firing from orbit: a nuclear-tipped missile. The goal of a nuclear arsenal is not just to respond to a nuclear attack, but ideally to be able to destroy an enemy's own nuclear arsenal before they have a chance to retaliate. With nuclear weapons, speed is key. Yet even at a whopping 4 miles per second, an ICBM launched from Russia at the United States would still need about 41 minutes to reach the East Coast. If we put nuclear weapons in orbit though, that flight time would potentially shrink to mere minutes. The International Space Station, or ISS, orbits the Earth at 5 miles per second, making a complete orbit in just 92 minutes. If a nation were to build a constellation of just 6 nuclear-armed orbital stations at the same altitude as the ISS, 250 miles above Earth, there would always be one station loaded with nuclear weapons flying over enemy territory, and the next station with its nuclear payload would be a maximum of 15 minutes away. Most nuclear nations operate a nuclear launch and detection system made up of a small fleet of satellites that are constantly scanning the Earth for the telltale massive heat signature of an ICBM being fired. Once detected, other satellites and ground tracking stations use radar to track the ICBM. But a nuclear-tipped missile fired from orbit wouldn't need a big rocket motor. Instead, each missile could simply be released, use small RCS thrusters like those used on space capsules when docking to orient each missile to a different target, and then let gravity pull them down to Earth. Without a big, very hot rocket motor, an early warning and detection system would be useless, and outfitting a missile with radar-absorbent materials like those used on modern stealth aircraft would make radar tracking extremely difficult. Basically, a nation could launch a crippling sneak attack against another nation, decimating its nuclear stockpiles and ICBM launch complexes, and 15 minutes later have another salvo ready to fire as a new orbital station moves into position overhead. So why, especially during the heated rivalry of the Cold War, hasn't any nation done this? The official reason is the UN's Outer Space Treaty. Ratified on October 1st, 1967 by 107 countries, including China, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the treaty served as the basic legal framework upon which international space laws could be built upon. With the space race in full swing and humanity's imagination picturing a near future of space colonies and interplanetary travel, it became clear to the UN that space itself would soon have to be regulated much the same way we regulated the open seas with international maritime laws. Much more pressing, though, than a need for basic laws governing the use of space was the reality of potential conflict between two very hostile nuclear powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction, had for the moment maintained the peace and kept either nation from even flirting with the possibility of nuclear war, as each nation knew it could never survive a retaliatory strike. But with space technologies and capabilities rapidly evolving in both nations, the possibility of one nation putting nuclear weapons into space and thus circumventing the safeguards of the MAD doctrine became very real. Thus, while the Outer Space Treaty governs the use of space and prohibits nations from claiming sovereignty over any moon, planet, or anything in between, the main goal of the treaty was to ban the use of nuclear weapons in space and thus maintain the security of the MAD doctrine. This is the legal reason why no nation has ever tried to put weapons into space. But the Outer Space Treaty only governs weapons of mass destruction, and while, as we saw before, missiles or guns would do very little good in space, other weapons known as kinetic impactors would be extremely effective. Basically nothing more than a very large and very dense projectile, a kinetic impactor uses only its own mass, velocity, and kinetic energy to deliver incredible devastation. The impactor has no chemical explosive and relies on fundamental physics. Because force equals mass times acceleration, by dropping something very massive or dense from orbit and letting the force of gravity accelerate it to thousands of miles an hour as it falls, you could potentially deliver a destructive blast on par with a small, tactical nuclear weapon. In fact, the US military has used similar weapons before in both the Korean and Vietnam War. Known as lazy dog bombs, the projectiles were nothing more than 2-inch-long pieces of steel outfitted with fins. When dropped from an aircraft, the projectiles would reach 500 miles an hour and be capable of penetrating 9 inches of solid concrete. Not bad for having absolutely no explosive. So then why has no nation put kinetic impactor weapons in space? The reason, it turns out, is a matter of simple self-preservation. If any nation began such a program, every other nation on Earth would face 3 choices. A. Allow that nation to complete its orbital weapon system program and be at their mercy forever. Or B. Begin their own orbital weapon system program. Or C. Immediately go to war with that nation before they can complete building their orbital weapon system. In order to avoid all-out war, or risk creating an environment where even if it fields its own orbital weapons, a nation is still critically vulnerable to hostile orbital weapons it cannot possibly counter, the United States, Russia, and other spacefaring nations have, to date, simply refused to build these weapons. In the best case scenario, putting orbital weapons in space would simply force other nations to do the same, creating yet another mutually assured destruction scenario. Given how many close calls we've had already with our Earth-bound nuclear arsenals, it's ultimately best we simply stay away from putting any weapons in space, period. Another close call many of us have had is nearly choosing the wrong website builder. That's why we use Wix. Wix is the perfect platform to create any kind of hobby or professional website that you can think of. Whether you need a website for your space photography or you're looking to advertise your new spaceship building business, Wix has a solution for all of it. Create the amazing website that you've been thinking about and support the Infographics Show at the same time by going to wix.com/go/infographics or by clicking the link in the description. Don't wait until it's too late, get a head start today with the amazing website you deserve. But what do you think? Should nations have the right to put anything they want in space? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called What Happens When You Get Knocked Out. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!